The Unwanted, Chapter 5, April 29th through the 30th, 1975. My brother and I spent the next 8 hours sleeping in a corner of the embassy lobby while the adults waited for the return of the helicopter. My mother tried to wake me for lunch and supper, but in my deep sleep, I just pushed her hand away. When I finally decided to get up, the sun had almost set. Its light soared in a wanton shade of pale orange over the city. There was still a residue of the irksome gas from the air. From my window, I looked directly out on the entrance of the embassy, where I could clearly see the struggle continuing among the soldiers and people from outside the gates. Only now the crowd had tripled in size and had become twice as restless as in the morning. All were men, since women and children had long given up fighting. A few in the crowd were armed with guns and grenades, but no one dared use them yet, except to hold them up in threatening gestures. The MPs were ordered to keep the gates securely shut, and they allowed no one to enter. I could see a few shiny yellow passes reflected in the light from the afternoon sunset as they were being raised above the crowd. The MPs ignored them. I ventured up the stairs and out onto the roof where my mother had told us to meet her right after we woke up. Through the long hallways, I noticed that the building was vacant, like an empty matchbox. Everyone else had gathered up on the roof, which was a very luxurious spot. At one end was a recreational area complete with an outdoor swimming pool, plastic tables and chairs with shades and exotic plants. The rest of the roof was a smooth, square, solitary platform reserved for the storage and landing of choppers. Besides my mother, Mrs. Duong, and David, there were 5 American men standing casually by the pool. Their circumstances were basically similar to David's, in that they had stayed behind of their own volition. They were a team of international journalists who had volunteered to record the fall of Saigon. Like everybody else, they had been chased from city to city, watching helplessly as the communist battalions devoured the land before them, piece by piece. Now they too were at the end of the last road with nowhere to run. The only thing left for them was to wait either for the helicopters or for the Viet Cong, whichever came first. But unlike everybody else, the Americans seemed untouched by the tide of hysteria. They stood nonchalantly by the pool, perspiring profusely from the intense temperature, eating their dinner, and discussing world peace in humorous terms. By midnight, most of us had abandoned all hope of escape. Nevertheless, no one moved. I sat on the floor by my mother, who held my brother in her arms while she settled deep into her own private world. A few feet away from us and facing us, Mrs. Duong folded her body into a fetal position, with her head clutched between her arms, and stared blindly at the dark space behind me. Every time she heard an engine sound, however faint, she would leap up gleefully, just for a second, long enough to recognize whatever it was. Then she would fall back down to the ground, embracing herself again in the same position. In the thick silence, we counted the chimes from the nearby church each time it struck until dawn came. That morning of April 30th, 1975, outside the gates of the U.S. Embassy building, the mob had grown so large that it spread over 10 blocks. From above, the streets looked like a massive hive of killer bees boiling with rage. We watched in frustration as helicopters from many nations carried out rescue missions in several parts of the city, but none came for us. Suddenly, as if God had decided to step into the chaos himself, every loudspeaker from every corner of every street simultaneously blared at maximum volume, halting the entire city. A moment later, the familiar voice of President Yung Van Min rumbled in the air. He tearfully read to his people a letter of surrender, relinquishing Saigon to the communists. It was 10:30 a.m. At that exact moment, we realized that 2 Vietnamese helicopters had separated from the frenzied motion in the sky and were hovering above us. One was disguised with blue-green marine camouflage. The other, much smaller, was a metallic silver in color. Upon seeing them, Mrs. Duong let out a shrill cry. She fell to her knees and cried gratefully to God and the heavens above for responding to her prayers. Soon, we were all either howling like wolves saluting the full moon or just shrieking with sheer delight. The choppers were also catching the attention of people on the street below. As they got closer, the yells from the crowd soared louder. Fists were pounding in the air, and people were screaming with all of their might, "Wait for me, let us in, for God's sakes, please." As the helicopter got about 30 feet away, I could see Mr. Duong standing in his doorway, wearing his properly pressed white collar shirt and black pants, laughing to his wife triumphantly. He was in his 40s, bald and dainty, and quite animated. His head was well hidden inside the military helmet, which was a size too large, making the rest of his body appear smaller. His torso was secured to the aircraft by a seat belt wrapped around his waist. He waved happily and signaled that he recognized us as well. The wind swept powerfully from the propellers to churn the air below like a close-up cyclone, beating each gust wildly on, over, above, and around us. The other helicopter circled at a slight distance, waiting for its mate to land on the roof. Then it happened. From somewhere in the crowd, someone fired a rifle. The bullet tore through the air and struck the side of the helicopter. Then, more guns were fired from the crowd. The helicopter pilot lifted his big bird back up into the sky. Mrs. Duong ran to the edge of the balcony and pleaded with the crowd, "Do not shoot, please. Stop shooting. My husband is up there." She jumped up and down to make herself more visible. David leaped from under a table to pull her back down. She fought him off weakly, still begging the mob below, "Please don't shoot. Please don't, please." But it was too late. A bullet had found its way to its target. From where I was, I could see Mr. Duong's bright white shirt blossom into a wet trail of red blood, oozing out eerily as he tried to cover it with his hands. "No!" cried Mrs. Duong from the deck. Mr. Duong faced his wife from up above with a surprised look, as if he were unable to comprehend what had just happened to him. The glimpse between them lasted less than a second before he lost his balance abruptly. The helicopter twirled itself into a half circle, knocking Mr. Duong to the floor, still tied securely by a seatbelt. Another hail of bullets hit the front propeller. The chopper twirled in midair like a sick sparrow, then stopped momentarily before it plunged down to the quarterdeck below and exploded into flame. The blast blew across the pool, temporarily blinding me. In an instant, all that was left was a burning chopper lying on its side, dying slowly under the blue sky and hot sun. Above it, the other chopper turned around and disappeared from sight. From the street, the crowd screamed in satisfaction. "No!" Mrs. Duong's voice was barely audible. Her knees buckled and she fell to the floor. Everyone was too shocked to do anything but watch her collapse like a rag doll. From a far corner below, marching toward the embassy, came the first troop of the Viet Cong's military, playing some strange anthem with trumpets and a bass. Their trucks and tanks, concealed under thick layers of dust, roared into the city. On top of these vehicles sat the red soldiers. Some held up flags, either with the red background and one yellow star in the middle, or a half red, half blue background, also with a yellow star in the center. Others pulled out banners with slogans scribbled on them. I could make out some of the phrases, such as, "We come in peace," "Let's heal the wounds the capitalists left behind." North and South Vietnamese are siblings. We can all stop the fighting now. The music filled the air with happy notes designed to soothe the tension of those on the street. David turned to my mother and said, "I'm sorry. It is over. The war is over. We can't keep you here anymore. Take your sons and your friend out of this building before it is too late. We are better off here by ourselves without any Vietnamese. Do you understand me? Get out of here now. Good luck and take care of yourselves, all of you." In a last desperate burst of energy, Mrs. Duong tried to approach the dead helicopter in hopes of finding her husband's body, but to no avail. We were pushed hastily out the door. We held on to each other tightly until we got down to the street. No one bothered to notice any of us as we let ourselves out through the gates, mixing into the stream of people surging everywhere. The communists marched slowly down the avenue, greeting people on both sides of the street and handing out little portraits of Ho Chi Minh, together with paper flags, as if these things were small treasures. Finally, they got to the front of the Daulat Palace. Using their tank as a bulldozer, in one swift motion, they ran down the iron gates while the people applauded and cheered. Saigon was claimed at 11:30 a.m., April 30th, 1975.